I've told this story maybe 100 times. At bars on Thesson Station, in bunks during transit jumps, once at a Senate hearing on Earth where they made me wear a tie and sit under fluorescent lights that buzzed like dying insects. Every time I tell it, somebody calls me a liar. Every time, I tell them the same thing. I was there. I saw his face when he made the choice, and I watched the galaxy burn and rebuild itself around that one quiet decision. My name is Sergeant Ronan Callister, Terran Combined Forces, 7th Expeditionary, retired. I was 29 years old when I stood in the Hall of Ascension on Valith Prime and watched Captain Declan Voss do the single most confusing thing any human being has ever done in front of 400 alien dignitaries. He smiled, walked past 5 of the most powerful, most beautiful, most politically valuable royal daughters in the known galaxy, and chose the one they called the Hollow Princess. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand what the galaxy looked like in those days, because none of this makes sense without context. The Rathani expansion war had just ended. 14 months of fighting across 3 galactic arms. Humanity had entered the conflict late, which was our usual thing back then. We'd watch from the sidelines, issue vaguely concerned diplomatic statements, stockpile munitions, and then show up when everyone else was bleeding out on the floor. Cynical, sure, but it worked. The Rathani were an insectoid hegemony. 6 limbs, compound eyes, hive-linked neural architecture. They didn't negotiate. They consumed. 31 species had signed the Galactic Concord specifically to counter them, and when the Rathani finally broke through the buffer zones in the Pellis Reach, everybody panicked. The Velithi called for help first, then the Sarani, then the Dreth. One by one, the old powers sent their fleets and watched them get swatted out of orbit like gnats. That's when they came to Earth. I remember the day the delegation arrived at the UN compound in Geneva. I was stationed there as part of a security rotation, which mostly meant standing near doorways and trying not to fall asleep. 3 Velithi diplomats in their flowing chromatic robes, a Sarani trade minister who smelled like burnt copper, and a Dreth military attaché whose tusked jaw could have bitten through a car door. They asked humanity to join the war. The General Assembly debated for 9 days. The Senate Armed Forces Committee held closed sessions. Pundits screamed at each other on every news network. And meanwhile, every combat-ready soldier I knew was already packing. We didn't need convincing. We needed orders. When the orders came, they came fast. Terran Combined Forces mobilized 3 full battle groups in under 6 weeks. The aliens were stunned. Later, a Velithi admiral named Sephara told me that most conquered species took 8 to 10 months to fully deploy a single battle group. We sent 3, fully provisioned, fully armed, ready to fight. She said we were either brilliant or insane. I told her we were usually both. The war itself isn't the story. Not really. But you need to know a few things about it, because otherwise what happened in that hall won't land right. Declan Voss was a captain in the 41st Mechanized Infantry, 32 years old, originally from a town called Cedar Falls in Iowa. Average height. Brown hair that never sat right no matter how much he combed it. Quiet in that way that made people lean in when he spoke, because when Declan talked, it usually mattered. I first met him on the troop carrier Resolute, 8 days out from the Pellis Reach. We were playing cards in the mess. He sat down across from me, introduced himself like we were meeting at a neighborhood barbecue, and proceeded to win 4 hands in a row without changing expression. I liked him immediately. Most people did. There was something steady about him, not flashy, not the kind of soldier who gave roaring speeches or charged into fire screaming. He was the kind who checked your equipment before a drop, remembered your sister's name, and somehow always knew which corridor to take when the base layout didn't match the briefing. During the Battle of Varentho's Crossing, Declan led a ground assault against a Rathani hive node that had chewed through 2 Sareni armored divisions. He had 400 soldiers. The hive node was defended by an estimated 12,000 drones. He took it in 9 hours. Not through some grand tactical maneuver, not through overwhelming force. He noticed something no one else had. The hive drones rotated their defensive patterns on a cycle. Every 47 minutes there was a gap, not a big one. Maybe 90 seconds where a single approach corridor was undertended. Most commanders would have dismissed it. The window was too narrow. The margin for error was non-existent. Declan drove a mechanized column through that gap 6 times in a row, each time peeling off a squad to hit a different structural support. By the 7th cycle, the hive node collapsed from the inside. 12,000 drones, 400 humans, 19 casualties. After Varenthos, his name started circulating through the conquered command structure. The Velithi called him the Patient Blade. The Dreth, who respected nothing except combat results, simply started including him in their war councils. By the time the Rathani sued for containment, Declan Voss was the most decorated human officer in the combined forces. He had more commendations than he had shelf space. 3 conquered species had independently offered him honorary military ranks. He turned them all down politely and asked for shore leave. That's who Declan was, the kind of man who won a galactic war and then asked to go fishing. Now the Hall of Ascension. After every major conflict, the Galactic Conquered held a ceremony called the Binding of Houses. It was old, centuries older than human involvement in galactic politics. The idea was straightforward in theory and deeply complicated in practice. The greatest heroes of the war were offered the chance to form a union bond with a royal house of one of the conquered member species. It wasn't marriage, exactly. The word they used was vithrai, which translated loosely as joining of fates. A union bond meant that the hero and the royal became politically, diplomatically, and socially linked. Their futures were intertwined. The hero gained the resources and standing of a royal house. The royal house gained the prestige and military reputation of the hero. It was an honor, the highest the conquered could offer, and it was deeply, deeply political. In previous wars, the binding had been limited to heroes from established conquered species. This was the first time a human had been eligible. The first time any of them had to reckon with the fact that a species they still privately considered, promising newcomers, had produced the single most effective battlefield commander of the entire conflict. The conquered couldn't ignore it. To exclude Declan would have been a diplomatic catastrophe. Earth's government was already leveraging its wartime contributions into trade negotiations and territorial claims. Snubbing their greatest soldier would have turned leverage into resentment. So they included him. First selection, in fact, which was customary for the war's most distinguished officer. First selection meant he would choose before anyone else. He would have his pick of every eligible royal daughter or son in the conquered. And that's where the trouble started. Valith Prime was gorgeous in a way that made you feel small, not in a bad way, in the way that standing at the edge of a canyon makes you feel small. The sky was lavender, shifting to deep violet near the horizon. The architecture was grown, not built. Crystalline towers that spiraled up from the planet's surface like frozen music. The air smelled like rain and something sweet I could never identify. The Hall of Ascension sat at the center of the capital city, Ithara. It was a dome of translucent stone, veined with bioluminescent channels that pulsed gently in the perpetual twilight. Inside, the floor was polished to a mirror finish. Tiered galleries rose in concentric rings, filled with dignitaries from every conquered species. I counted at least 60 different species in the first 3 rows alone. I was there as part of Declan's security detail, which was technically unnecessary since the hall was the most heavily guarded structure on the planet. But protocol required it, and truthfully, I wanted to see what was going to happen. Everyone did. The ceremony had become the most talked-about event in the galactic press cycle. Not because of the ceremony itself, because of the princesses. There were 6 eligible royals that cycle, 6 daughters of the great conquered houses, each representing a different species, a different civilization, a different flavor of power. I'd studied the briefing files, we all had. First was Princess Thessara of House Velithi. Tall, luminous, with skin that shifted color like an oil slick on water. The Velithi were the founders of the conquered. Choosing Thessara meant choosing the center of galactic power. She was considered the obvious pick by virtually every political analyst in known space. Second was Commander Vexi of the Dreth Dominion. She wasn't technically a princess. The Dreth didn't use that word. She was a war daughter of the Iron Throne, which was their equivalent. 7 feet tall, tusked, built like a siege engine wrapped in gray skin. Choosing Vexi meant choosing the most formidable military alliance available. The Dreth respected Declan. A bond with Vexi would have cemented that respect into permanent alliance. Third was Illumara of the Sareni Collective. The Sareni were traders. Merchants. Their economic networks spanned the galaxy. Illumara was breathtaking in the way that something made of crystal and light is breathtaking. She moved like water. Choosing her meant choosing wealth beyond calculation. Fourth was Priestess Yanvari of the Keseth Theocracy. The Keseth were the galaxy's spiritual authority. They administered the ancient shrines, maintained the sacred corridors between star systems, and wielded a soft power that even the Dreth respected. Yanvari was serene and untouchable, draped in robes that seemed to absorb light. Choosing her meant choosing divine legitimacy. Fifth was Narine of the Talveshi Federation. The Talveshi were scientists, engineers. Their technology was 2 generations ahead of everyone else's. Narine had 4 arms, compound lens eyes that glittered like gemstones, and 3 doctoral equivalents in fields that didn't have English names. Choosing her meant choosing the future. And then there was the 6th. Lyri of House Cathari. I need to be careful here because the way the galaxy talked about Lyri before all of this happened was cruel, not in the obvious way. Nobody stood up and said terrible things about her. It was worse than that. They were polite about it. The Cathari were a small species. Their homeworld, Kethar, sat in a sparse region of the Outer Reach. No major trade routes ran through their territory. Their military contribution to the war had been minimal, not because they were cowards. They simply didn't have the resources. Kethar was a fading world. Its star was cooling. Its oceans were receding. The Cathari had been slowly, quietly dying for 3 centuries, and everyone in the conquered knew it. They stayed in the conquered out of tradition and pity, and everyone was too polite to say that out loud. Lyri herself was small, not short exactly, delicate. She stood maybe 5'4" in Terran measurements. Her skin was pale gray, almost silver, with a faint translucence that made her look like she was carved from moonlight. Her eyes were large, dark, and utterly still. No pupils that I could see, just deep, dark pools that reflected whatever light touched them. She had no bioluminescence like the Velithi, no imposing physicality like the Dreth, no shimmering beauty like the Sareni. She stood at the end of the line in a simple gown of woven gray fabric, and she looked like a ghost standing among goddesses. The other royals had entourages. Thessara had 14 attendants. Vexi had an honor guard of 6 Dreth warriors in ceremonial armor. Illumara had a retinue of trade advisors whose jewelry alone could have bought a small moon. Lyri had 1 attendant, an elderly Cathari woman who stood behind her and said nothing. During the preliminary reception the night before the ceremony, I watched how people moved through the hall. Thessara was surrounded. Vexi drew a respectful perimeter. Illumara attracted a constant orbit of sycophants. Lyri stood by a window, looking out at the lavender sky, and nobody approached her. Not nobody, that's not fair. A few dignitaries stopped by out of obligation. They'd nod, exchange a few words, move on. The way you'd greet the host's elderly aunt at a party before finding someone more interesting to talk to. I watched this from across the room, and something about it bothered me, not in a sentimental way, in a wrong way, like watching someone get picked last for teams and knowing the people doing the picking were making a mistake. But I couldn't have told you why, not then. The morning of the ceremony, I helped Declan with his dress uniform. This sounds more personal than it was. In practice, it meant I stood in his quarters and handed him things while he muttered about collar stays. He was calm. That was the strange part. Anyone else in his position would have been strategizing, running scenarios, consulting advisors. Earth's diplomatic corps had spent 3 weeks sending him briefing packets, analysis documents, and strongly worded recommendations about which princess to choose. They all said Thessara, every single one. The political logic was airtight. A bond with the Velithi founding house would elevate humanity's standing in the conquered by a century overnight. Trade access, diplomatic weight, military cooperation. It was the rational choice, the smart choice. The only choice, according to everyone who claimed to know anything about galactic politics. Declan had read the briefings. I know because I'd seen them stacked on his desk, annotated in his small, precise handwriting. But that morning he wasn't reviewing them. He was standing by the window, looking out at the crystalline city, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hands. "You read the files on the princesses?" he asked me. "Yes, sir." "What'd you think?" I wasn't sure what he was asking, so I defaulted to the safe answer. "Thessara seems like the politically optimal choice, sir. The diplomatic corps is unanimous." He didn't respond for a moment. Then he took a sip of his cold coffee, made a face, and set it down. "Did you read the file on the Cathari princess?" "Lyri, yes, sir, briefly, I had. It was the thinnest file in the packet, 4 pages. Most of it was background on Kethar's declining status. The section on Lyri herself was barely a paragraph, born during a period of ecological crisis. Educated in Cathari traditional sciences, no notable political achievements, no military record, no diplomatic experience. Under strategic value, someone had written, minimal. "What did you notice about her file?" Declan asked. I thought about it. It was short, sir. It was almost empty. He turned from the window. His expression wasn't angry or frustrated. It was focused. The same look he got when he was studying terrain maps before an assault. 4 pages, 3 of them about her planet. They wrote more about her planet dying than they wrote about her. "The Cathari aren't exactly a major power, sir." "No, they're not." He picked up his jacket from the back of a chair. But the file listed her academic credentials, traditional Cathari sciences. "Do you know what that means?" I didn't. I looked it up. Took me a while. There isn't much about Cathari academia in the standard databases. I had to dig through some old archived records from a Sorani anthropological survey. He buttoned his jacket, checking the alignment in the reflection of the window. "Traditional Cathari science isn't like our science, Callister. It's not physics or chemistry or biology in the way we'd understand them. The Cathari study systems, living systems, the way everything connects to everything else. How an organism relates to its environment, how environments relate to each other, how entire ecosystems communicate." "Sounds like ecology, sir." "It's ecology the way a symphony is a collection of sounds. Technically accurate. Completely inadequate." He straightened his collar. "The Cathari have been watching their world die for 300 years, not passively. They've been studying it, mapping every cascade failure, every feedback loop, every tipping point. They understand systemic collapse better than any species in the galaxy." He said this like it was the most important thing he'd said all morning. I didn't understand why. "With respect, sir, that's academically interesting, but the ceremony isn't about academics. It's about alliances, power, the future of humans standing in the conquered. He looked at me then, and there was something in his eyes that I've thought about many times since. Not pity, not condescension, something more like disappointment, not in me specifically, in the question itself. The future, he repeated quietly. Yeah, that's exactly what it's about. He didn't say anything else about it. He finished dressing, squared his shoulders, and walked out of the room. I followed him, still thinking about dead planets and system failures, and wondering what any of it had to do with choosing a princess. The Hall of Ascension was full by the time we arrived. I don't mean crowded, I mean saturated. Every seat in the tiered galleries was occupied. Every standing space along the walls was claimed. Holographic relay drones hovered near the domed ceiling, broadcasting the ceremony to every conquered world simultaneously. Later, they told us that the live viewership exceeded 900 billion sentient beings. 900 billion. Watching one man walk across a polished floor. The 6 princesses stood on a raised platform at the far end of the hall. They were arranged in order of their house's founding date within the conquered. Thessara on the far left, luminous and regal. Vekshi beside her, massive and impassive. Ilumara shimmering. Yanvari serene. Narine alert and analytical. And Lyri at the end, small and gray and still. Declan stood at the opposite end of the hall, alone. Protocol required him to walk the full length of the chamber in full view of every dignitary, every camera, every watching eye. The walk of selection, they called it. Dramatic, theatrical, designed to maximize the political impact of the moment. The conquered's High Chancellor, an ancient Velithi named Mordhan, stood between the princesses and the approaching hero. His chromatic robes were deep indigo, signifying the gravity of the occasion. When he spoke, his voice resonated through the crystalline walls. Captain Declan Voss of Earth, Terran Combined Forces, bearer of the Silver Meridian, victor of Varentho's Crossing, defender of the Pellis Reach. You stand before the assembled houses of the Galactic Conquered, recognized as the foremost champion of the Allied cause. By ancient right and binding custom, you are granted first selection in the binding of houses. Approach and declare your choice. The hall went silent, not quiet, silent. 900 billion beings held their breath. Declan stepped forward. His boots clicked on the mirror-polished floor. Each step was distinct, measured, not slow, not fast, the pace of a man who knew exactly where he was going. I was standing along the left wall near the 3rd tier. I had a clear line of sight. I could see his face. Calm, focused, that same expression from the quarters, the terrain map look. He passed the midpoint of the hall. Thessara straightened slightly. Her attendants shifted. The Velithi delegation in the galleries leaned forward. This was their moment. Everyone knew it. Declan kept walking. He reached the platform, stopped, looked at Thessara. And then he looked past her. Past Vekshi. Past Ilumara, Yanvari Narine. His gaze settled on Lyri. The silence changed texture. It went from anticipation to confusion. I saw it ripple through the galleries, heads turning, glances exchanged. The Velithi delegation froze. Declan took 3 more steps, past Thessara without a word, past Vekshi, past all of them. He stopped in front of Lyri. She looked up at him, those dark, reflective eyes. I couldn't read her expression from where I stood, but I could see that she didn't flinch, didn't waver. She met his gaze like she'd been expecting him. Maybe she had. Declan spoke, and in the perfect acoustic design of that hall, every word carried to every ear. I choose Lyri, of House Cathari. I want you to understand what happened next because it's important. It wasn't gasps. It wasn't outrage. It wasn't anything that dramatic. The reaction was something quieter and honestly worse. It was embarrassment. The kind of embarrassment you feel when someone does something socially incomprehensible. When someone shows up to a formal dinner in a bathrobe, and nobody knows whether to address it or pretend it isn't happening. 1,000 faces in those galleries went through the same rapid sequence: confusion, discomfort, and then a settling into polite bewilderment. The High Chancellor recovered first. His chromatic skin flickered through several colors I didn't have names for, which I later learned was the Velithi equivalent of sputtering. "Captain Voss, perhaps you wish to reconsider. The binding is a matter of great consequence. All houses are worthy, of course, but traditional considerations of—" "I've made my selection, Chancellor." Declan's voice was steady. Not aggressive, not defiant, just certain, the way you'd say your own name. Mordhin looked at Lyri, looked at Declan, looked at the other princesses, several of whom were displaying various species-specific versions of shock. Thessara's skin had gone a flat, dull gray. In Velithi body language, that was the equivalent of someone's jaw hitting the floor. Vekshi's tusked jaw had actually clenched, which for a Dreth was a sign of respect being forcibly recalculated. Ilumara simply went still, her crystalline features frozen in mid-shimmer. Only Narine, the Talveshi scientist, showed something different. She tilted her compound lens eyes toward Lyri with what I'd later learn was intense curiosity. Like she was seeing something she hadn't noticed before, and was annoyed at herself for missing it. The Chancellor completed the rite. He had no choice. The binding ceremony didn't include a mechanism for rejecting a selection. It had never needed one. No one in the history of the tradition had ever made a choice that required overriding. The selection is witnessed. The bond is declared. Captain Declan Voss of Earth is joined in Vithrai with Lyri of House Cathari. May the joining serve the peace and the future of the conquered. The words echoed. The bioluminescent channels in the walls pulsed once, a deep, resonant blue, which was apparently the traditional acknowledgement. And then people started talking, all at once. The reception afterward was the most uncomfortable social event I've ever attended, and I've been to mandatory military sensitivity training seminars. Nobody knew what to say. The Velithi delegation was humiliated. They'd spent months preparing for a bond between Thessara and the human hero. Trade agreements had been pre-drafted. Cultural exchange programs had been outlined. An entire wing of the Velithi royal palace had been redecorated in what they imagined was a Terran aesthetic, which apparently involved a lot of blue and a confusing number of eagles. All wasted. The Dreth were more direct about their feelings. A war daughter being passed over was not a thing they processed quietly. Vekshi's honor guard stood in a tight cluster near the refreshment area, radiating the kind of cold fury that made nearby diplomats find reasons to be elsewhere. The Sarani were already running economic projections on their wrist displays, calculating the financial implications of a bond with a declining species. The numbers were not flattering. And the Cathari. The Cathari delegation consisted of Lyri, her elderly attendant, and 2 junior diplomats who looked like they'd been hit by a stun round. They stood near a column, surrounded by a wide berth of empty space, and seemed to be processing the fact that something they had never expected, never prepared for, and possibly never wanted had just happened to them. I found Declan near a window, holding a glass of something purple that he wasn't drinking. "Sir, with respect, what the hell?" He glanced at me, almost smiled. "You're not the first person to say that in the last 20 minutes. The diplomatic corps is going to have you court-martialed." "They can't court-martial me for following the Concord's own ceremony rules." "They'll find a way, sir." He did smile then, small, brief, probably. I stood beside him, looked out at the same lavender sky. "Can I ask why?" He was quiet for a long moment. Below us, through the crystalline walls, I could see the city of Ithara stretching toward the horizon. Beautiful, ancient, powerful, everything the Cathari were not. "During Varenthos," he said, "when we were planning the assault on the hive node, you remember how we figured out the 47-minute cycle?" "Yes, sir." Everyone praised the tactic afterward, called it brilliant, innovative, but it wasn't. It was obvious. The pattern was right there in the sensor data. Anyone could have seen it. But nobody did, sir, except you. Because nobody was looking at the right thing. He turned from the window. They were looking at the drones, the defenses, the firepower, the obvious threats. I was looking at the gaps, the spaces between the threats, the thing nobody thought was important. He looked across the room to where Lyrie stood by her column, quiet and gray and utterly overlooked. Everyone in this room is looking at power, he said. Military strength, economic leverage, political influence. They're looking at the big, obvious things and trying to grab the biggest piece. Isn't that the point? It's the point if you think the future looks like the present. If you think the galaxy is going to keep working the way it works now, same power structures, same trade routes, same alliances. He set down his untouched drink. But it won't. The Rathani War proved that. 14 species with standing armies couldn't stop them. It took a newcomer species with a different way of thinking to turn the tide. The galaxy's balance of power isn't stable, Callister. It's fragile, and nobody's paying attention to the cracks. And Lyrie, the Cathari. The Cathari have been studying cracks for 300 years. They know more about how systems fail than anyone in the Concord. And Lyrie, he paused, looked at her again. Did you know she published a treatise when she was 19 on cascading systemic breakdown patterns in closed ecological networks? It was submitted to the Sarani Academy of Sciences. I didn't know that. Almost nobody does. The Sarani rejected it, didn't even review it. A paper from a Cathari academic about ecological collapse. They filed it as low priority and forgot about it. What was in it? Declan's jaw tightened, just slightly, the only sign of anger I saw from him all day. She mapped a collapse pattern, a specific sequence of failures that cascades through interconnected systems, environmental, economic, political, military. She called it a convergent failure spiral, and she didn't just describe it theoretically. She identified 3 active spirals in the current galactic structure. He let that sit. 3 active spirals, 3 places where the galaxy is quietly breaking, right now, in ways nobody's paying attention to. Because everyone's too busy looking at the big, obvious pieces. I stared at him, and you believe her. I checked her work, took me 2 weeks. I ran her models against every dataset I could access. Rathani expansion patterns, trade route disruption metrics, resource depletion curves across the outer reach. He met my eyes. She's right about all 3. The noise of the reception continued around us. Polite laughter, diplomatic murmuring. The sound of 400 powerful beings, thoroughly misunderstanding what had just happened. The galaxy doesn't need another military alliance, Declan said. It doesn't need another trade network. It doesn't need spiritual legitimacy or technological supremacy. It has all of those things, and the Rathani nearly burned it down anyway. He straightened his jacket. What it needs is someone who can see the failures coming, someone who's spent her whole life studying how things fall apart. He looked at me one last time. I didn't choose the least valuable princess, Callister. I chose the only one the galaxy actually needs. Then he walked across the room toward Lyrie, and the crowd parted around him like water, and 900 billion watching beings started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they'd misjudged both the man and the woman he'd chosen. The fallout was immediate, and depending on your perspective, either terrifying or hilarious. Earth's diplomatic corps sent 17 strongly worded communications in the first 48 hours. I know because Declan showed them to me while we were eating breakfast in the guest quarters. He read them with the same mild expression he wore while reading equipment requisition forms. This one uses the phrase, catastrophic misjudgment 3 times in 2 paragraphs, he noted, taking a bite of toast. The Velithi version of toast was a flat, warm crystal wafer that tasted like honey and cardboard. They've also included a formal request for me to reassess my position in light of strategic imperatives, which I think is diplomatic code for please fix this before we all get fired. And I'm having breakfast. The media response was worse, or better, depending on how much you enjoy chaos. Human news networks ran the story for weeks. The framing was predictable. War hero throws away galaxy's greatest honor. Voss chooses unknown princess, political disaster or romantic gesture. That last one was from a tabloid that ran a digitally enhanced image of Declan carrying Lyrie across a moonlit threshold, which was impressive given that no such event had occurred. The alien media was more measured in tone and more devastating in substance. Velithi commentators expressed profound disappointment and concern for humanity's diplomatic maturity. A Dreth military analyst went on a widely viewed broadcast and said, in the blunt Dreth fashion, that Declan had mistaken a ceremonial blade for a writing implement and used it to sign his species' irrelevance. That one actually made Declan laugh. The Sarani financial markets reacted with characteristic efficiency. Cathari cultural assets, which had been trading at negligible values, experienced a brief spike driven entirely by curiosity and speculation. It corrected within hours. The Sarani were not sentimental investors. Only the Talveshi seemed genuinely intrigued. Nareen, the Talveshi princess, requested a private meeting with Declan 2 days after the ceremony. I was outside the room, so I don't know exactly what was said, but when Declan came out, he looked thoughtful. She asked me if I'd read Lyrie's treatise, he said. The one the Sarani rejected. She read it, Nareen, after the ceremony. She stayed up all night and read it. He paused. She said it was the most important piece of systemic analysis she'd encountered in her career. A Talveshi scientist said that about a Cathari paper. She also said it terrified her. Meanwhile, I was doing something I rarely did. I was thinking. Not about politics or alliances or the diplomatic fallout. About the gap between what I'd seen and what I understood. Declan had made a decision that every qualified observer in the galaxy considered foolish, and the more I learned, the less foolish it seemed. That dissonance nagged at me. So I did something about it. I went to talk to Lyrie. This was not officially sanctioned. I was a sergeant. She was now, technically, bonded to the most prominent human in the galaxy. Protocol would have required at least 3 layers of diplomatic approval. I found her in the guest quarter gardens. The Velithi grew their gardens vertically, spiraling plants up crystalline trellises that caught the perpetual twilight and refracted it into soft rainbows. It was beautiful. Lyrie was sitting on a bench beneath one of these trellises, her old attendant beside her, both of them looking at a portable display. The attendant saw me coming and stiffened. Lyrie looked up. Sergeant Callister, she said. Her voice was quiet, not weak. Quiet the way deep water is quiet. Declan mentioned you. I hadn't expected that. He did. He said you were the most honest person on his security detail. That if I wanted to know what humans actually thought, as opposed to what they said in briefings, I should talk to you. I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a setup. He's too kind, ma'am. He isn't actually, he's precise. She gestured to the bench across from her. Sit. I sat. Up close, she was different than she'd appeared from across the hall. Not grander or more impressive. More detailed. Her gray skin had subtle patterns in it like the grain in polished wood. Her dark eyes, which had seemed flat and featureless from a distance, had depth to them. Layers. Looking into them was like looking into water and realizing the bottom was much farther down than you'd guessed. You want to ask me something, she said. Yes, ma'am. You want to ask if I know why he chose me. I already know why he chose you, ma'am. He told me. Your work on systemic failure patterns, the convergent failure spiral. Something shifted in her expression, subtle, a tightening around the eyes that might have been surprise. "He understood the paper," she said softly. "He said he checked your models against available datasets, said you were right about all 3 active spirals." She was quiet for a moment. Her old attendant placed a hand on her arm, a gesture of support. Or warning, hard to tell. "Do you know what it's like," Larry said slowly, "to see something that everyone else refuses to see, not because they can't, because they don't want to? I've been in the military for 10 years, ma'am. I have some idea." The corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, an acknowledgement. "My world is dying," she said. "Kethar has been dying since before I was born. My grandmother remembered the oceans being full. My mother remembered them being half empty. I've never seen them full at all." She looked at the portable display. Whatever was on it, she turned it off. "When your world dies slowly, you have 2 choices. You can grieve or you can study. My people chose to study. We mapped every step of the collapse, every feedback loop, every point where a small intervention might have changed the trajectory. We became, I think, the galaxy's foremost experts on how things fall apart. And no one listened. Why would they? We're a dying species on a dying world. What could we possibly know about preserving anything?" The bitterness in her voice was old, worn smooth like a stone carried in a pocket for years. "The Sarani rejected my paper without reading it. The Velithi categorized our research as cultural heritage documentation. The Dreth don't study failure. They only study strength." But Declan read it. Declan read it. She looked at me directly, those deep, dark eyes. And he didn't just read it, he understood it. "Do you know how rare that is, Sergeant? Not the intelligence, the willingness. The willingness to look at something uncomfortable and not turn away." I thought about Varenthos, about the hive node, about a man who looked at gaps instead of threats. "I think I do, ma'am." She studied me for a long moment, then she leaned forward. "The 3 spirals I identified in my treatise. Would you like to know what they are?" I nodded. "The first is ecological. 17 worlds in the Pellis Reach are experiencing simultaneous soil degradation patterns. Not from the war, from industrial agricultural practices that the Sarani trade network incentivized over the past century. Within 40 years, those worlds will be unable to sustain their populations. The resulting migration pressure will destabilize the entire reach." She held up a second finger. "The second is economic. The Sarani financial network is built on the assumption of continuous expansion. New markets, new resources, new trade routes. But the galaxy is running out of accessible space. The frontier is closing. When it closes completely, the economic model collapses, and the Sarani take everyone who depends on their network down with them." A third finger. "The third is military. The Rathani were not an anomaly. They were a symptom. The galactic power structure concentrates military capability in a handful of species and leaves everyone else dependent. When a threat emerges that those species can't handle, the entire system fails. It already happened once. It will happen again. And next time, there might not be a newcomer species conveniently available to rescue everyone." She lowered her hand. 3 spirals, 3 slow-motion catastrophes, each one individually survivable, but they're not individual, Sergeant. They're interconnected. They feed each other. Ecological collapse drives migration. Migration destabilizes economies. Economic instability weakens military coordination. Military weakness invites external threats, and external threats accelerate ecological destruction. She paused. "It's a loop, and it's already turning." I sat there on that alien bench under that alien sky and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not fear exactly, recognition. The same feeling I'd had in combat when you suddenly realize the situation is worse than the briefing suggested. "How long?" I asked. "At current trajectories. The first major cascade begins in approximately 60 to 70 years. Full systemic failure within a century and a half. A century and a half, that's not imminent. It is to a species that thinks in centuries, Sergeant. The Velithi have governed for 2,000 years. 150 years is tomorrow to them. They should be terrified. She leaned back. They're not, because they're not looking. I understood then, not fully, not the way Declan did, but enough. He chose you because you're the warning system, I said. The early detection. He chose me because the galaxy is a system. And systems don't fail all at once. They fail in patterns, and someone has to be watching the patterns. She looked up at the crystalline trellis above us, where refracted light played across the climbing plants. My world taught me how things end, Sergeant. That's not a gift anyone wants, but it might be the one everyone needs. I left that garden feeling like I'd been handed a puzzle box that I could almost solve. The pieces were all there. The logic was clear, but the emotional weight of it, the sheer scope, kept sliding off my understanding like water off glass. 3 spirals, a century and a half, the whole galaxy slowly eating itself. And one woman who could see it happening. And one man who believed her. I walked back through the crystalline corridors of the Velithi capital, past dignitaries who were still buzzing about the ceremony, past media drones recording reactions, past Dreth warriors and Sareni traders and Keseth priests, all of them locked in their own immediate concerns. None of them looking at the gaps. That night I stood outside Declan's quarters while he and Lyrie had their first real conversation as bonded partners. I couldn't hear what they said. The doors were sealed, and I wouldn't have listened anyway. But I stood there in that corridor for 2 hours, and I thought about Iowa, about a man from a small town in a small state on a small planet, who looked at the vast, glittering machinery of galactic civilization and saw the cracks that nobody else was willing to see. And I thought about a woman from a dying world, who'd spent her life mapping the anatomy of collapse, waiting for someone, anyone, to take her seriously. They found each other across a polished floor, under the eyes of 900 billion beings, and the galaxy thought it was watching a mistake. It wasn't. It was watching the beginning of something.